Hello, my name is Eike, and I want to tell you about our experience in creating a DAO governance framework. When we started out with the project, we had three objectives in mind, three main objectives. Number one, we wanted to ensure that the workplace was more democratic and that everyone in the team that was important for the company had something to say in the company, and they were not just managed, as it is now common in today's workplace, by some manager that didn't know what he was doing. Second, we wanted people to be engaged, and those two are very much related. By being a democracy, people are naturally more engaged. And three, we felt that if people are contributing, they should also have a fair distribution of the success. So everyone in the team should share the success, not only via employee share options, but by really being an owner. Those were the three main objectives. Now then we looked at alternatives to get inspirations from different thinkers that had talked about similar ideas over the last 200 years. And of course we came across socialism, and we looked at socialism because the basic idea to have not the riches with the capitalists, but have the workers have more equality and have the workers participate in the success, yeah, that made a lot of sense. But the problem with the socialism is that it's the state that is making decisions. And in fact, it is the opposite of decentralization. It's actually very centralized. There is this joke that in the Soviet Union, where one of the bureaucrats asked, "Why do we have this nail? That doesn't make any sense. This one nail." I said, "Well, you told us to have a certain amount of kilograms of nail, and we fulfilled the planning. So if you make a plan far removed from the people who need it, the people, the citizens, you make a plan somewhere centrally, then many times it's gonna go against what the people really need." So capitalism, as the opposite, actually is very much built on decentralization. People make decisions decentrally. Every citizen makes a decision decentrally, and the way they make decisions is basically by the buying decision. By the buying decisions, they give indications for other people what they want and what needs to be produced. So there doesn't need to be any central planning. So that's great. However, as we have seen, this kind of capitalism over the last century, and especially over the last 5 years, 10 years, we have seen a large concentration of wealth in the hand of a very few amount of people, and also a large of decision making in the hands of people that are controlling, aided by technology, and nowadays aided by AI, are able to control many different other workers that are just doing a mindless job. So we looked at Marxism. Marxism is a bit different from socialism. Now, socialism, actually Marx was the original socialist, so his idea was not that the state would have an important role inside the organization or the economy. What Marx wanted is that we have a democracy inside the organization. Now, that makes a lot of sense, and we love the idea of Marx to have the democracy inside the organization, to have every worker participate in the decision making and not have the capitalists make the decisions. Now, the problem with it is that there's several, but two important problems are that each person has one vote, and not everybody is the same. You have some people who are very experienced, some people who have been with the company for a long time, other people who are with the company for just weeks and maybe just interns. They should not have the same amount of power inside the company. And then another problem is that Marx assumes that the companies, the capitalists, are making a lot of profit, and that this profit is a surplus profit, and therefore the idea was that the surplus profit gets distributed among the workers. But as we know, most startups fail And many times there is no surplus profit, but there's actually a loss. So you're working and you're getting, as an entrepreneur, and you're getting very little paid. So if we are letting other people in to be co-entrepreneurs, to be co-founders, to do this together as a team, when there is a loss, then everyone has to assume this loss. And some people are just not so willing to assume this loss. And then you need capitalists, you need investors to give you some money so that you're able to distribute cash to the team. So we looked at others. We looked at sociocracy. But then we quickly realized that sociocracy really is more of a management philosophy or a communication style. But it doesn't really have rules in who is the owner of the company and how does voting work. Because the main idea is, how do people work together in different circles? And yes, these circles to some extent are decentralized, and to have consensus rather than voting. So, for example, for us, yes, we mainly use consensus, but at the end of the day, you still need to know who has the ownership and who has the control, the voting rights. And sociocracy doesn't talk about it. Then we have, on the other hand, we have different organizations or different legal frameworks that are saying, we are a DAO. We make a DAO possible. We have a DAO LLC, for example, in Wyoming. We have the Marshall Island DAO organization. So yes, that is nice to have, but that's to the outside. So this company legislation is on the relationship between the company and between the outside world. It doesn't really talk about the founders and the relationship between the founders. So sociocracy, as we've seen, is just really no rules. It says, founders be nice to each other, have nice communication, and the legal frameworks for DAOs basically say how the structure, the company, the organization, what form it has, and how it relates to the outside world. Now, what we want to know is, how do we make the best organization inside, especially focusing on the voting rights and on meaning the control rights, and on the financial benefits, the financial rights, the ownership. So we can look at this as three levels. So on the one hand, we have the external law. And for example, what we just looked at, MIDAO, the DAO LLC, that focuses on the external company law in the relationship between the company and the government, the company and the customers, the company and the public. Then we have, on the other hand, inside, we have the internal organization. That is more like sociocracy. How do you organize? Do you have sprint meetings? Do you work in an agile way? Do you have a hierarchy, or do you have a flat organization? So this is sociocracy is one of those principles that we use, but it doesn't really define the ownership nor the voting. So what we need to have, and the most important thing for us, was how to define the ownership and the voting. So there are DAOs, and we can take a look at DAOs. The only problem is, when we take a look at the DAOs that have sprung up over the last 3 years, we see that the DAOs are either a single purpose or they're a scam. So single purpose DAOs could be a DAO that wants to buy a constitution, or a DAO that wants to invest in other creative projects or in other companies and other DAOs. This is a single purpose, and the main purpose is just to invest. And so the DAO holders, they get to decide on the use of the money. But if you have a startup, you need to have marketing, you need to have accounting, you need to have talking to the investors, you need to have product, you need to have, meaning content, marketing, technology. There are so many things you need to do, and each of those you need to spend resources, and that means money. Now, it can be crypto, it can be cash, but there needs to be determination on the salary, on what you're going to do in the marketing, in the product, and all of this are so many decisions that the one purpose DAO doesn't give you any guidance on how to take these decisions. Now, we have the scam DAO, but that's not really anywhere close to being a DAO in the sense of a DAO being there to have less centralization, more decentralization, less autocracy, more democracy, less resignation, more engagement, more productivity. All of this, what the utopia maybe, or the dream of the DAO, scam DAOs are just the opposite. Scam DAOs are when a company just wants to have money. The founders just want to have money. So the founders make a company. They call it DAO. They then get investors to pay for a token that they have created within minutes. And they take the money for themselves, put it into the company. They own 100% of the company. They own 100% of the money invested, and they merely give proposals to the token holders. So you have the token holders that are participating in the DAO that have a very limited say to vote on proposals. And then you have, this is on-chain, okay, so it seems like everything is just governed by blockchain. But then you have the company where the owners are 100% the founders, and the company has gotten money, and the founders can use the money in any way they want to. And most of the time, this has been what is happening. There is no accountability, and founders are just using this money for their own personal gain. And so we need to, and I was recently talking to a team of lawyers that analyze DAOs, and I was asking them, so this DAO that you were analyzing, how much money did they raise? And the answer I got is, well, you can take a look at the valuation of the token. The founders, they got 30% of the token, the rest was to the public. And I was saying, wait, that's not what I was asking. And they seem to think that the only asset there was a token. But we have cash, we have equity, and we have tokens. The tokens take 5 minutes to create. And then you give out the tokens as the founders, and the investors, the DAO participants, they give you the money, and you keep 100% of the company. You keep 100% of the money you get, and then you give out most of the tokens, and you seem to be generous because you give out these tokens that took you no effort to create. So this is what I really call a scam DAO. So basically, we haven't been able to get a lot of information on other projects that are working as a non-scam DAO. That really want to give out the whole equity of the company and have the treasury be voted on democratically and transparent. And on the they work on a real startup, not only on a single purpose DAO, but really on a startup including all of the startup operations. So we knew at the beginning we want to have certain principles in this DAO. And first of all, we say, look, there's a lot of work that has already been done. Let's take the learnings from socialism, the learnings from capitalism, and let's see how we can use blockchain technology to make something that hasn't existed before, and that's much better. So from capitalism, we look at the decentralization, that there's no government instance centrally that's making the decisions, but individuals can make the decisions for themselves. But we also see that there are things that are not working here because we have now a lot of centralization. On the other hand, we look at socialism. We look at the promise of people coming together, having more equality, and being able to participate in decision making democratically. And then we look at blockchain technology, how we might be able to put these rules onto an on-chain contract and thereby make the organization more efficient. Now, in coming up, so we need to have the rules. So the rules are essential, the rules for the DAO. And in coming up with these rules, we see that currently the big flaw that people are making is they only think about code. They think about how to put the rules, very simplistic rules, into code. But they don't think about what rules to have. And if you want to put it into code, at the current state of affairs, it's very hard to put very complex rules into the code, into, let's say, computer code. And so what has been put into code by other DAOs is very, very simplistic rules on different forms of voting, which are great that we can put it into code, but an organization that is, again, not a scam DAO and is not a single purpose DAO, but it has to manage a whole organization with marketing, product, technology, accounting, finance, and so on. You won't be able to manage with these simplistic rules. So you first of all have to look at psychology and behavioral economics and game theory to basically look at how do humans make decisions and how can you make it so the humans are happy and the humans are motivated to produce the best results. Because in the end, it's all about humans and human psychology. And then you have to look at the law. You have to look in the law in terms of two things, in terms of how the outside law, the law of the country that you're operating in, interfaces with your rules, and if your rules are actually legal. And second, you need to use legal principles to make the law, to make a structure so that it's easily understandable and usable. So there's certain legal principles on how to write law. Very similar to writing computer code, you also have principles to write law, to write legal rules, let's say on paper, that you then put into code. So those three things. And it's important that we start with psychology, then go to the law, and then once we have made the rules, then we just try to put them from the paper to the code. Now, there is an assumption that I strongly disagree with, which is that at some point it will be possible to make the rules so good and put everything on chain that there doesn't need to be any more human intervention. So basically all the rules that you have written down will go into code, and it's a smart contract and it's going to operate automatically. And there are two flaws with this. And they both have to do with the same thing, which is that the real life is, there's infinite complexity in real life. And therefore, one, it is impossible to put this complexity of life into a code, be it in writing as a law or be it in the computer code. And second, it is, again, because it's so infinite complex, it is impossible to know what the exact circumstance was of a certain fact that occurred that then you have to compare to the code. So to make this, and the reason why I have this, the code civil here, is because this is a code. I mean, that's interesting. It's a legal code. And it's was a code from 1804 that Napoleon made. And the idea of Napoleon was the same as now of many blockchain enthusiasts, that you can make a code that is so detailed that there will be no more intervention by the judges. So this objective of eliminating the judges, of eliminating human intervention, and just have a code that is so clear that you just read from it and you know the decision, that is 200 years old. The Code Napoleon, and even more. That was in the end of the 18th century. But what people came to realize very quickly is that it's impossible to make law or code or rules that are so detailed that you can that you've captured every single possibility in it, and that there's basically no more decision-making power on what to rule, and that basically you can eliminate all judges. And so if you and I think the people that are having this idea, they really haven't worked with a DAO in practice, because in the DAO that we've been working for the last year and a half, so many times we saw, damn, there are things that we haven't considered. Okay, so we made this even more complex, but there were also so many things that we knew that it was impossible to codify. So I'm going to give you an example. We had a person that some founders felt had made misogynistic comments. Now we have something in our culture code that is against racism and against misogyny. And so people said, well, we need to find this person. But then the question was, how do you define misogyny? And what is enough to be misogyny? If I'm saying, let's say, an evil word about one woman, could that be interpreted as misogynistic? So then how do you define this? And then of course the question is, what exactly was said? Because then you need to have the information on what happened in real life in order to put what happened in real life into the code. And in blockchain, you always need to have an oracle. An oracle is the connection of the real life, what's going on in the real world, to the code. And currently there is no way to have a non-human AI oracle. The oracle is always going to be human. So yes, blockchain code is hard to change. It doesn't change. It's not impossible to change, but there's always going to be some human intervention that makes the input. So it's hard to change, and you can make a smart contract so that there is an automatic consequence that's defined in the code. But what you put into the contract, meaning for example, this person has worked so and so many hours. Well, a person works a certain amount of hours, and then this person needs to put it into this data into the DAO code. Well, so who is putting this information, and how do we ensure that this information is correct? So you always need to have human intervention. Okay. Okay. So now to the DAO principles. The principles that we felt, knowing the other people that before us that worked on something similar to DAO to make the organization better, more efficient, as well as more equitable, more fair. There's certain principles. The first principle is unity. So unity for us means that we don't want to do a DAO only for the workers and not neglect the contribution that are being made by the capitalist, by the person that's giving the money, the investor, by the people that are somehow contributing. They can be external partners, and on the other hand, of course, we don't want to have a DAO which favors the investors. What we do is we just say, look, there are different ways to contribute. We have one objective, and this objective is to, in our case, is our business objective. So I don't want to go into the business objective, but there's one objective that any organization has. And there can be different contributions. You can make the contribution in kind. You can make the contribution with your work. You can make the contribution with money. And you can be an employee. You can be a freelancer. You can be an advisor. You can be a partner. So different ways. But we put everybody together in one basket, and we look at one thing. We look at what is the contribution that has been made by that person. And dependent on that, we give that person ownership, which means voting rights and financial benefit. Okay, number two, because of what I just explained, that ownership depends on contribution, the shareholding has to be dynamic. That means very different from the traditional companies and traditional startups, where the founders get together at the beginning and they decide how they want to distribute the shares among themselves, and then they have a very small pool of stock options for future employees. What we say is everybody gets the same deal. There's only one deal, but this one deal means that everybody will need to see who is contributing what, and based on the contribution, give ownership. But then the percentage ownership that somebody gets in the shareholding in the company depends on how much contribution they have made divided by how much contribution has been made in total by them and everybody else. And that means dynamic, because if I make a certain contribution at the beginning of the company, which might be, say, 10,000, and the total company made 20,000, I have 50% of the company shares because I made half the contribution. But then I leave it at 10,000 and I don't contribute anymore for 1 year. And during this 1 year, the other people make a huge contribution of 1 million. Then before I had 50%, now I have 10,000 still, the same contribution, but the total contribution is 1 million, so I just get 1%. So it's dynamic. It changes basically every single day that anybody makes a contribution. Now, another thing is we do pay in cash, because now sometimes the DAO holders are only they can only get tokens when they pay when they pay cash to the company. Sometimes the DAO holders can get tokens or participate in the DAO for making a work contribution. And what we say is we need to go beyond that, because if a person wants to work in the organization and we want this person to contribute a lot, meaning maybe full-time, and to have the person work full-time, if they would like to work full-time and it makes sense for the organization that they work full-time, then there needs to be possibility for the organization to pay them in something which they can use in order to cover the living expenses. And that can be cryptocurrency, it can be fiat currency, but it can't be our own token, because unless our own token is liquid enough that the person can exchange it and actually be able to go to the supermarket and buy some groceries. Now, what we also then say is if a person gets paid, then we need to see how much payment they get, and the contribution they made in terms of the work is net, is how much they have gotten, the contribution they made gross minus what they have been paid. Then important for us is individualism. That's one of the principles of our DAO, because we don't think it's fair, nor is it productive, for the very senior person who has been working with the company for over a year and who has a lot of responsibility in the company to get the same amount of ownership and voting rights as the most junior person who just came in on an internship. So we have to look at how much time did you spend with the company, and what is your seniority? What is your, let's say, your hourly rate? And again, if somebody gets paid a lot of money for their work, basically the same as they would be earning on the free market, then we wouldn't give them much ownership. So it's also not fair that this person has the same voting rights as the person who basically just works and works and works and works and doesn't get any kind of cash compensation. So we do differentiate between different individuals depending on what they are contributing to the company and what they are receiving from the company. And then finally, related to that, flexibility. Because we say, look, it's only one variable that counts for how much ownership you get. That's the amount of contribution you make. We don't really care when you make this contribution, how much you want to work, from where you work. You're all flexible. Now we have some kind of procedures internally. For example, we use an agile methodology. That means that there should be some Scrum meetings, and people are supposed to come to these Scrum meetings. But generally, we try to give the largest amount of flexibility to each and every person. Now, these are the principles of how the DAO works. Now let's look into the DAO mechanics, how it works in practice. And again, what we're looking at is the middle layer. So the outer layer we said is the company law, is how the company interfaces with the outside world, with the government, with the public, with the customers. The inside work is how we internally organized in terms of using an agile methodology, using a management by objectives, having different teams. What we're looking at now here is the ownership and the voting is a middle layer. How do we define the ownership and the voting? And we've made it possible to have a DAO within a very traditional company, a C Corp, Delaware C Corp. Now, a Delaware C Corp has, I'm just trying to make an abstract diagram here. So we have a traditional organization that is wrapped around a traditional C Corp legislation. And there we have founders, and those are also the shareholders. And these founders get shares of the organization, and they are within the registered within the company registry. Now, that makes it impossible to have a dynamic shareholding if every founder has to go to Delaware to register their shareholding. So we cannot have this kind of structure, but it is not a problem to work with Delaware C Corp because we can have a derivative. The founders can invest via a derivative instrument, a derivative of the shareholding. So how does this look like? We have the same organization with the same legislation in Delaware, a Delaware C Corp. But now none of the founders gets direct shares in the company. But instead, 100% of the shares are being held by a trustee. And the trustee is legally the owner, is legally the financial beneficiary and the person having all the control. But we have then an agreement with the founders that's called the trustee agreement that really means that all of the benefits the trustee gets are given to the founders because the trustee cannot accept any financial benefit. All of them has to be passed to the founders. And all of the control rights have to be passed to the founders. So all of the voting by the trustee has to be made in accordance to what the founders want. So, and then we have the trustee agreement with the founder organization. And inside the founder organization, we have the founders that have an agreement within themselves. So we have a trustee agreement and we have a founder agreement. And together, we can work with a traditional with a traditional Delaware C Corp, but work in a way as described using all the DAO principles. Now, this was actually not our own idea, this company structure. We looked at crowd investing. So you might know that there was WeFunder, Start Engine. In the UK, you have Cedars, Crowdcube, and in the US, you now also have Republic, that some of you might know, where small investors are able to invest with amounts starting at $100 into startups. Now, you might have thousands of investors investing in a startup, and each of them investing $100. That, of course, would not be workable in case all of these investors want to be part of the cap table of the organization. So what a company like Republic does is they would have a trustee, they would be the trustee, they would get a certain percentage, let's say 10% or 5%, and then the investors would invest via Republic, and Republic would in exchange give them the rights, the financial rights and the control rights, and the control rights can be exercised by logging into a dashboard where the investors, the crowd investors can vote. So they vote via Republic, and then Republic will use the shares that they have to control the company. Similarly, we do the same thing. Similarly, we do this just with the founders. So in our specific case, we actually have an investor, two angel investors, that didn't know what a DAO meant, and they felt more comfortable to have a traditional safe investment. So they invested in the traditional C Corp, in the traditional way. But the founders, they are all hold the shares via a derivative, which they get via the trustee. So it's basically the opposite as crowd investment works. And you could combine the two. You could have crowd investment and you could have crowdfunding. Crowd founding, I was going to say. Okay, now let's go to the voting. That's of course an important part, and voting is being discussed in DAO governance quite a lot. One of the realizations we made is that voting shouldn't only depend on token holdings. Voting shouldn't only depend on ownership, because we want the person that is voting to have a stake in the company, so that's ownership, but we also want them to be competent in what they do, and the competence and the competence in what they're actually working on in the company. So if we just have a capitalist voter who has tokens, but who doesn't have any role inside the company, and who doesn't have much understanding because he's not involved in the day-to-day organization, then we don't want them to have too much voting power. On the other hand, if we have a person that just came in, let's say a new hire for CTO, and this person has a lot of responsibility for the whole product and technology, but the person doesn't have much ownership, because in our organization you get ownership over time, and so you have responsibility but no ownership. We want this person to have some kind of voting power. So instead of only looking at ownership, we look at ownership plus responsibility, 50-50. And that has worked out quite well. Now, additionally, we made an adjustment, which is sometimes, in most cases, we have a certain voting decision which concerns a certain segment of the organization. Could be, for example, we want to vote on marketing, we want to vote on product, we want to vote on technology. So in that case, either the decision is taken internally by that team, or if it is company-wide and the whole company gets to vote, then still the people that are involved in that particular area that is at concern for the decision get their voting multiplied. Their responsibility is multiplied by a certain factor. Okay? Now, liquidity. Generally, one of the big achievements of blockchain is to have fast liquidity. And that's the whole reason why ICOs exploded, because people could sell their acquired tokens right away. Now, if we want to be sustainable over a long period of time, it's important for us that the people stay with us and they just don't acquire tokens by the contribution and then sell them right away. So similarly, as there are restrictions on traditional founders selling their shares, we have to restrict the tokens being sold. Now, in traditional startups, there is the saying that you really want the founders to be the major shareholders. And the reason for that is that the founders are the ones that make or break the company, so they should have a high skin in the game. You don't want the founders to sell all the ownership, because then the people that are able to make or break the company, they don't have any more interest in the company. Now, we have not only 2 or 3 or 4 founders, we have around 30 founders, because we're able to include founders that only have a part-time contribution, and we actually we let much more people inside the DAO. So what does it mean regarding the founders having the main shareholdership? Well, of course, most founders do not have more than 5%, because if it's impossible for 30 founders to all have more than 5%. So what you really want, what really is important for the sustainability of the company, is that the owners are the workers, is that the people that have biggest skin in the game are the people that have the biggest responsibility. So what we found out, what we need to do is we need to track who has which responsibility inside the company, then track who has which ownership inside the company, and then have mechanisms so that we want to give the people that have too little ownership, because we go compared to the responsibility, more shares, and to those people that have more ownership compared to their responsibility, less shares, so that we try to get closer to the ideal scenario where ownership and responsibility is the same. Now, vote concentration. That's another thing that we found is important to deal with, because ideally we have, as I just mentioned, we have the people that have the highest responsibility have the highest amount of ownership, and as we have responsibility distributed among everyone, there is not too much vote concentration. But it just works out the way that some people are able to work without getting cash compensation because they have a financial cushion. Others need more cash, and needing more cash means you get less shares because you're taking cash and you don't go for the ownership. At the same time, other people can contribute more, others contribute less. Some people are more senior than others people are more junior. So what you end up with is some kind of concentration. And we want to prevent this concentration. So how can we do this? Well, one thing is, of course, not being able to just freely be able to sell your shares and buy your shares. That's one thing. But more importantly, felt, okay, so we need to have a quorum on the important voting decisions that affect everybody. We need to have quorums. It can't just be a 50-50 majority rule. That's one. But even beyond that, we felt we need to have an institution that represents the minority shareholders. And that we call the Founder Council. The Founder Council, we have 3 people that are voted by one person, one vote, that deals with any kind of founder issues and is able to take decisions on payment, on cash payment, on the money factor that I will explain later, and on hourly rates. So it's a little bit like a union inside a startup, inside a DAO. Next, empowerment. How do we achieve empowerment? So the first thing is democracy. It's by having decisions be democratic and having people be able to participate in them, you empower them more, they feel more engaged. However, in fact, and what I think is often not recognized, is that democracy many times means centralization, and we many times want the opposite, which is decentralization. So to have decentralization, you want to have the individuals that are working on a certain problem make the decisions themselves, and not to have the company make the decisions on a central level. So empowerment means, yes, you want to have democracy when you do take central decisions, but you want to take most of the decisions decentrally. And then finally, you want to try to work with consensus rather than voting. So again, democracy means for many people voting, but we found that many times it's better to not have a vote, to just do things consensually, unless it doesn't work out, unless there's really disagreement and you need to have a vote. In that case, you vote and you let democracy decide. But most cases, we can just listen to each other, listen to the best opinions, and come to a decision via consensus. Now, one important thing is speed. If you want to have a decision making where more people are engaged, meaning democracy, that can slow you down. Now, I already just mentioned, we found that it's good to have many decisions be made by the individuals that are working on a certain problem themselves, by everybody being empowered and not having to refer to the authority of somebody else. But still, we want to have sometimes decisions voted on democratically. But then what do we do with speed? If we are a startup, we need to be fast. So what we have made, and what works really, really well, is to have 3 levels of decision making by having 2 shortcuts. The shortcut number 1 looks at what we call the founder 1A. Those are the founders that are the core founders that have more than 5%. And if these people already get to a decision, a unanimous decision, we would already have more than 50% engaged, because these people by themselves already hold more than 50% of the responsibility and of the ownership. Now, if they don't come to a decision, or if it's kind of close, then we go to the founder 1, tier 1 founders. The tier 1 founders are more founders as everybody who has at least 1.5% responsibility. So then we look at there. And only when there is, again, some ambiguity on which side is going to win, would we then go to everyone else. Now, that of course means that the founders that are less involved, that have less than 1.5% responsibility, get to vote less. But that's okay, because not everybody really wants to be involved as much as possible. Most people have jobs, they just have an advisory role. So yes, you want to have them involved. You want for them to be able to always be able to table issues, but for them to vote, it would be just too much work for them. So that's why a tiered voting, having vote tier 1A founders vote first, and then tier 1 founders, and then everyone else, has worked really well for us. Now, another thing is culture. We want to have a certain culture. And of course, the culture is mainly about working remotely, working flexible. And that means it's actually an anti-culture, because if you're not working in the same place, if you're not working together in one organization, it's hard, it's easy for there not to be a culture. But what has helped us is to make a culture document. We call it the culture code. We ask all the founders what's important for them in an organization. We came up with this culture code in a democratic way, and this is what we like to have every new team member go through to make sure that they are a fit for the culture. Now, if a person comes in, it's quite easy for us to get started because we don't give them a certain amount of shares to start with. And so we just say, hey, you're doing a good job. I think you can provide value. There's a certain hourly rate. Let's get started and let's see how it goes. Now, on the exit, it's also quite easy. And there have been exits, yes. And I think it's quite normal, especially if you're a large organization. If you hire quickly, then it just so happens that people go quickly. Because if you're a founder, then you want to make sure that the person that's coming into the organization is really vetted 100% before you let them in. For us, we let people in quite easily, but then of course many people also leave easily. And it's also, it's not a problem for us, because the main reason being that in traditional organization, when somebody joins as a founder, they get a certain percentage. It can be 10%, it can be 5%, it can be 1%. But then they hold this percentage. And then when they leave, you have to renegotiate, or they have to give back the shares. And that can be quite messy. For us, each founder has a certain contribution that they have earned, and they keep that contribution. Now, we don't want to have too many founders that are idle founders, that are passive founders, that have left the organization. So that we have rules whereby the organization is able to buy back those contributions. But the value of the contribution stays with the founders, and founders are able to exit quite easily. Now, very important concept, and I would say one of the most critical and the most talked about concepts inside our DAO is what we call the cash factor. And I'm writing a central bank because the cash factor gets determined in a similar way that the central bank determines interest rates. So when inflation goes up, the interest rates will be set higher. by the central bank. And if then the economy is slowing down, inflation goes down, also the interest rate is going down. Why is it? Because the interest rates, you're able to respond to the environment. Similarly, the founder council inside our DAO is setting the money factor. So in case a lot of people want cash, because we have this freedom of choosing cash and equity, choosing ownership, that means equity, or choosing just short-term cash. And if people decide they want cash, they don't want equity, then it easily happens that we have more cash to pay to the founders than is healthy for the organization. So what we would do is we'd say, okay, we need to increase the money factor. And we increase the money factor to such a level where then the founders no longer say they want cash, they will just go with the equity. Why? The money factor is divides all the cash that's being paid out. So currently the money factor is 4. Now, 4 means if you want to take out cash, your cash gets divided by 4. So let's say you earn in contribution value $1,000. Now we have this money factor of 4 that we apply to the $1,000. So you actually, if you're choosing cash, you're actually only getting 250. Now at the same time, the equity factor is currently around 2. And the equity factor multiplies the equity getting out. So if you're taking out $1,000 in equity, we will multiply it by 2, so you actually get $2,000. So now people might want to have cash, but if they have to decide between getting 2,000 in equity and 250 in cash, then it's not so clear anymore. And the money factor and the equity factor, they're related to each other by a formula. So as the money factor goes up, the equity factor also goes up. As the money factor goes down, meaning it becomes more attractive to take out cash, the equity factor also goes down, meaning it becomes less attractive to get equity. And this system has really worked extremely well. When tough times came around, people took less cash because the money factor went up. As things became brighter, we got investment, we get revenue, we decreased the money factor, the cash factor, and thereby it became less attractive to take equity, more attractive to take money, and people chose more money. Now, in conclusion, what so far with the DAO, what are the benefits? And I would generally say we are extremely happy with how the DAO has been working. But it is not perfect. Of course it's not perfect because it's a human organization. And in a human organization, you always have people competing with each other. You always have office politics. You always have some people that are less motivated than others. And you've always some people complaining. So it is a human organization, so you do have imperfection. However, what I really think has worked well is, on the one hand, we have been able to work with 30 co-founders, and these co-founders are like A+ co-founders. We're talking about ex-Google employees, we're talking about ex-Boston Consulting employees, we're talking about people who went to Harvard, people who went to Berkeley. We're talking about extremely smart people, extremely motivated people that we wouldn't have been able to have as founders in case we had a traditional founder structure. At the same time, these founders, they are active. They care about the project. They care about the project probably more than they would if they were in a traditional organization. Now, it's true that having 30 founders, not every founder is a major founder. Not every founder gets to make the major decisions. That's impossible because you only have 100% responsibility to give out. But still, having these limitations, I feel that we have achieved a lot of things due to the greatness of our founders and the motivation of our founders, it has been quite easy to grow the team because we can recruit new co-founders. We don't have much money to pay to the best contractors, the best employees, but we do have equity to give out. And giving out equity means we can get the great people to come into the team. So we've been able to grow the team with really great people. And what we've also seen is that there have been exits in the past, and sometimes these exits have been hard. When, for example, the person who was CTO, that co-founder, left. However, this our structure made it quite easy for us to handle this. If we would have had a traditional startup structure where this person had 20% of the equity and then we would have to buy back the equity, that wouldn't have worked. But having our structure, it's very easy for people to join and for people to also leave. And I think the best, the most impressive thing I'd say is how we've been able to master tough times. So there have been times when, for example, the CTO left, when certain investment money we were supposed to get didn't come through, where we had to increase the money factor. But those were the times where other people stepped up because they got more equity. Some people had to, let's say, reduce the time because we couldn't pay out the money. They reduced the time. They didn't leave the company. They just reduced the time. And I felt that these tough times actually made us stronger. So, and then finally, I would say just the happiness of the team. The happiness of the team, because I do believe that even though it's not possible for everyone to have an important role, people do feel that each person has an important role inside the organization. And I don't think this would have been possible in the traditional startup structure. So our experience so far has been extremely positive, and it's a model that is evolving. It has been evolving for the last year and a half. It has come to a point where I do believe that it's not evolving much more because we've already found what seems to be working the best. And I'd be happy to share our findings, the details on this with anybody who's interested.